All right, welcome back to another video. My name is Ian Major. I'm an entrepreneur, investor, and all-around raging capitalist. And I was going back and forth on the video for today. Obviously, we've seen very, very exciting price action in Bitcoin, above the 50K mark. Right now, it is the morning of February 17th here in Dubai. And as I was just looking, I didn't want to jump the gun. And so the video I was thinking about doing was to just kind of pummel you with all my favorite kind of short video Bitcoin memes, which are absolutely hilarious as a kind of celebration. But I didn't want to jump the gun too fast. Although if you look at the price right this moment, Bitcoin is obviously slapping me on the hand for being so bearish. So in a future video, maybe the next video I do, I will drop that one. And so if you're not currently subscribed, make sure you hit the subscribe button. That's going to be an awesome video, and there's going to be a lot more great content to come. So for now, though, I'm going to be covering in this video an equally important, if not more important topic, and that is to kick off a new series around the Austrian School of Economics. And a lot of the kind of core fundamentals of this school of thought are embedded into the Bitcoin monetary network protocol in terms of its monetary policy, etc. And this is not just important context for Bitcoin. I personally think it's very interesting, and it also has much broader implications for society beyond whatever that kind of monetary good is. And so that's what I want to do. If you're completely unfamiliar with the Austrian school, this was a school of thought that originated in the late 19th and early 20th century, as you can see here from the wiki page, in Vienna, with giants such as Karl Menger, Bohm-Bawerk. I know I'm butchering these pronunciations. But ultimately it's much more focused on kind of individuals acting in reality, with the notion that there are cause and effects to the kind of economic phenomena that we may observe. And so it's much more about trying to understand individual behavior and human action, which was the title of one of the seminal publications of Ludwig von Mises, who's another huge name in this school of thought. And there's many others. So I won't go into kind of the history and the figures, at least today. But what I will be doing is going through at least a part of this excellent tweet thread from Peter Young, covering the kind of fundamentals of the Austrian school of thought. And this is coming from the thinking of Rahim, Ronald, Mark here. These are three of the big names still in the Austrian school of thought. And so I just thought that this tweet thread was so excellently laid out. I wanted to just make kind of a series of videos on it. And so that's what we'll do. I'll go through a part of this today and we'll continue in future videos. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. All right, excellent. So we've got our first pillar here around subjectivism. And I'll go ahead and play. They've kind of got this clever animation here, but essentially this is to say that prices and the value of goods and services are determined subjectively, given that we live in a world where the future is uncertain. We have this extreme example on the right, but imagine if you were kind of tracking a turkey's well-being. You have this feeding period for the turkey where that turkey's kind of utility and well-being is going up. And so one would imagine, okay, well, that's probably what will continue to happen going forward. But boom, surprise, here's Thanksgiving and the well-being kind of falls off a cliff. And so this is simply to say we can't, use past price trends to confidently extrapolate the future, nor can we use other methods of assessing value. And this is actually a really big departure from some of the classical economics that essentially contended some sort of version of labor theory of value, meaning that the effort that goes into producing goods and services is what renders those goods and services valuable, which is interesting, right? You have folks like Adam Smith kind of tinkering with this concept that later goes on to become one of Karl Marx's main pillars of his economic theory, is this idea of labor theory of value. And so the way Marx articulated that is this concept of labor power. And so imagine kind of, the hours that society has to expend to, feed, shelter, etc., a unit of labor to then have the capacity to provide that labor in a productive way. That concept of labor power should be what is informing wages, and not the kind of valuation of the purchaser of said good or service. And so, for example, if it takes twice as long to produce a pair of pants as it does shoes, then the pair of pants should be about twice as expensive as per the labor theory of value. And so we can easily see how this kind of falls on its face, right? We can't force someone to value something just because we spent some of our time producing it, right? That's wishful thinking. And particularly when we consider the next key pillar, I think this will become even clearer. So the second pillar, continuing on that exact piece that we were just discussing around the labor theory of value, is called marginalism. And so this essentially, in tandem with the prior pillar, contend that value is not inherent in the goods themselves, right? There is no such thing as intrinsic value, but rather in the service rendered by acquiring those goods and services, and specifically by acquiring an extra unit or the marginal unit of that good. And this is what helps explain the kind of paradox of value, otherwise known as the water-diamond paradox. And it essentially says that, how could it be that the price of diamonds is so much higher than the price of water when water is so much more crucial to the survival of humanity, right? How could that be? And prior theories of value kind of failed to adequately explain this. And of course, the explanation is quite simple. It's water, at least relative to diamonds, is quite abundant. And so it's the scarcity of diamonds that makes them, that makes them valuable, right? And you can also, see how this would work in the context of, if you have, let's go with pizzas, right? If you have one pizza, that may, provide you with a sizable amount of utility. If you have a second pizza, it's going to maybe provide some incremental utility, but probably not as much as the first one, and so on and so forth, right? And so it should become very clear that the value of goods and services is highly dependent on the context and how many of those goods and services society kind of currently has. And then this third pillar stems nicely from the first two. The first two were really about how is value derived. And pillar 3 is essentially saying, who is doing the valuation? And it's really about individuals and individualism. And so I'll read this directly from Ludwig von Mises in his seminal work, Human Action. Methodological individualism, far from contesting the significance of collective wholes, considers it as one of its main tasks to describe and to analyze their becoming and their disappearing, their changing structures, their operation. It merely means that definite actions of individuals constitute the collective. And this should make, said another way, there is, this idea of, quote, the people or society. These are quite nebulous, right? And it's not the case that society has this, collective brain that it's using to make decisions, right? It's individuals that make decisions. I don't, share a brain with you, and therefore we're not making the same decisions. And so, what this means is that economic aggregates are not useless, but it's crucial to derive the more foundational elements that ultimately roll up to those economic aggregates. And so all these kind of individual millions of decisions being made by individuals on a daily basis, that is a crucial foundation to understand broader economic phenomena. And that may seem wildly intuitive and obvious, but the vast majority of modern economic theory completely kind of ignores this point. All right, and the fourth, and in this framework, final pillar is around causal realism, and again extends nicely from what we just discussed. Again, I'll read this directly from Safdien, who wrote the Bitcoin Standard. It is the action of humans that shapes economic outcomes, not the aggregate measures constructed in government statistical offices. This is not to say that all statistical measures are worthless noise, as there can be value to be had from examining these aggregates as close approximations of economic phenomena. The Austrian objection is in treating these statistical artifacts as causal factors and assuming the relationships can be extrapolated into the future predictively. And again, this should make sense. This should feel more grounded in reality. One of Keynes's famous quips was to explain recessions as abrupt decreases in aggregate spending caused by what he could only describe as animal spirits, right? Animal spirits are what cause recessions from the viewpoint of the man whose writings and theories underpin all of the modern economy, right? So for example, Keynes thought the absolute number one critical imperative was to drive aggregate spending. If aggregate spending was going up, it was a good thing because aggregate spending would produce more goods, which would employ more workers, which would drive unemployment down. And so if you kind of play that out, he also contended that inflation is essentially what happens when there's too much aggregate spending. And when you start to combine these things, it starts to just get very circular and nonsensical. So you're saying that inflation is when there's too much aggregate spending, and unemployment is when there's not enough aggregate spending. It would then reason to say that there cannot be periods in time where you have both high inflation and high unemployment. But as we know, there have been many instances of that historically, most notably perhaps in the U.S. in the 70s. And so this idea of kind of aggregate spending as the end-all, be-all, most important KPI that dictates economic policy is completely divorced from reality because it fundamentally ignores causal relationships between cause and effect. All right, and so with those four pillars, we're actually armed with quite a robust framework for thinking about economics. We've covered valuation, who's doing the valuing, in what context. And the next key concept that this leads to, and that we have to acknowledge, is that we operate in an environment of scarcity. And this is not a pessimistic view that bets against human ingenuity. In fact, quite the opposite. But rather, this is just to acknowledge reality that we can't, we can't create energy, right? Energy is neither created nor destroyed. That is a fundamental law of physics. And so we operate in a reality of scarcity. And this is despite what mainstream media, modern monetary theory, academia would have you believe, which is just a wild concept. There truly is no free lunch, and that's completely against what the modern school of economic thought would have you believe. But what we can do is construct this useful mental guide around this indifference curve where the trade-offs are consumption and investment. And so ultimately what this is saying is that given the scarce environment, we can arrange resources to essentially produce an aggregate output somewhere along this curve, right? And if I move further towards the consumption end, this could be me taking some of my savings and spending it on a big screen TV, versus moving more towards the investment end where I might take those same savings and actually invest it in starting a new a new business, right? That's just as an example. And so this grounds us in this idea of the production possibilities frontier. And so the final piece I want to leave you with in this video is how scarcity and this productivity frontier ultimately then intersect with economic growth. And on the left-hand side, we have this kind of moderate consumption, moderate investment scenario. On the right-hand side, we have a lower consumption and a higher investment scenario. And so let's see how things change over time as a result of these two scenarios. And so what you can see is that each new curve is representing the passage of 1 year. And so after a year, the left-hand side is, has progressed, right, due to productivity. But on the right-hand side, we've progressed far more in terms of the aggregate output or wealth that we're able to produce. And it's because we previously sacrificed a bit of consumption to instead direct more of our capital towards investment. And so this gets us to the kind of central idea that to increase the rate of economic growth, it really comes down to foregoing consumption. So, if our pace of productivity is as such initially, and we forego consumption in order to invest in more productivity driving technology, machinery, etc., we're then able to angle the slope of that line much more aggressively. And so again, this is a critical idea. You can paper over this reality with the idea that printed money can help you bend the curve without foregoing consumption. But as we will see in future videos, and as is hopefully becoming more and more apparent in the world today, that is a fallacious thought at best. All right, so there you have it. We'll continue on this thread in future videos. I didn't want to go too crazy on this kind of part one, but I hope you found this interesting. We'll pick up with key concepts around capital and interest in future videos that are super important and underpin the entire economy and society. But I hope you found this interesting. If you did, give this video a like. Go ahead and check out Peter over in his Twitter. Posts a lot of great content. And we'll go ahead and leave this here for today. As always, every sat counts, and I'll see you in the next one.